two sacraments in the Lutheran Church. And of course, the other sacrament is the Eucharist, the Holy Supper, or Holy Communion. But before we go on, I just really have to share this because it's my favorite communion story. And it's not exactly mine, but it came from my congregation small group leader. Her name was Kathy, and she told us that when she was brand new to our church, this happened. And this church that we were at always served communion by intinction. Just like we do here on Wednesdays or on Sundays at the early service, where you dip the bread into the wine. So when she came up front, she took the wafer and she ate it right away. Which happens. It happens a lot sometimes. It's really not a big deal. People are embarrassed, but yes, but you can take another piece of bread to dip, okay? Not a big deal. Except that it wasn't an accident that she did that. She meant to do that. And so then she stepped over to the pastor and she reached her hands forward and she took the cup out of the pastor's hands and she took a sip. The pastor had a rather surprised, confused, almost angry look on his face. And when Kathy realized that this was not customarily how we did communion there, well, she was completely embarrassed. She turned red. She said she couldn't look at or talk to the pastor for the next couple of Sundays. But fortunately, she survived. She came back and she became a small group leader. So that's my favorite communion story because it makes me feel better about all the silly things I've done. But anyways, different churches, different communities, different leaders, different traditions have very different customs and practices. Even churches within the same denomination, within the same beliefs might practice differently. By now, it is probably no surprise to most of you that I am a big fan of baseball. And yes, I am a Twins fan. I am a true Twins fan because they are 4-10, and I'm still a fan. They're gonna get there. In the world of Major League Baseball, there are 30 teams playing the same game. They are all professional baseball players, but there's a big distinction to be made because within Major League Baseball, there are two different leagues. You've got the American League, and you have the National League. There are 15 teams in each league, but all 30 teams will play with each other and against each other throughout the season. All these interleague games count towards their standings in their league. So what's the difference? Why does it matter? Well, rules. Primarily, there's one rule that they don't share that is the big conflict, and that is that the American League allows designated hitters. The National League does not. There you go. Where am I? The designated hitter is basically a player that only hits. And so they do it in place of the weakest batter usually that's playing defense, which is usually the pitcher. And I don't know the whole history of how this came to be, but I know that there are a lot of people who feel very strongly one way or another about this. I know that there are also a lot of people out there that watch baseball quite regularly and don't know that. It doesn't seem to affect the fact that they are a fan of baseball. The bottom line is that all these teams are playing baseball. They're all there for the same reason. When it comes to communion, there are some distinctions between how different traditions practice, which we know. But in our reading today in Luke 22, we hear the instructions from Jesus himself. This is my body which is given for you. Do this in remembrance of me. This cup is poured out for you in the new covenant of my blood. While we have different customs and traditions, it all comes back to Jesus' instructions. His instructions, which hopefully will sound very familiar, because they are part of the words of institution that we hear from the pastor before we receive communion. And there's one word in particular that always catches my attention. the word for. Both times Jesus said the body is given for you, that the cup is poured out for you. And when I hear this, and when people hand me the bread and offer me that wine during worship, my brain hears given to you. Why for and not to? Technically, grammatically, both could be proper. When I address a card to someone, I almost always write to person's name from Ashley. That's just natural to me. Well, come to realize, this is actually a really big grammatical hang-up for anyone learning English as a second language. When do you use to, and when do you use for? So we have to and for, not the number 4. All right, and as this came together, it's kind of like in a wrestling match. So, there. Wrestling. Boxing. I'm sorry, yes. Those are wrestling gloves? Okay. Just kidding. Okay. Alright. Grammatically, both of these words are prepositions, which means that the words connect two different things. But these words have two very different meanings. The word to simply means to transfer from A to B, or to give something. So we'll say transfer A to B. Alright, but the word for means the benefit of, the function of, or the purpose of. Now that's a really significant difference. Jesus is not just giving this to us, he's giving it for us. It's not just a transaction, so here you go. He's giving it for us. There is a purpose behind it. There's a benefit to it. There's a function for this meal. God has a purpose for this, and it's for you. Okay, so we know that this is the second sacrament, and I know that we all remember this from last week, so we don't really need to, but let's review just for fun what it means for something to be a sacrament. All right, number 1, God commanded it. He commanded his children to be baptized, and he commanded us to partake in the Holy Supper, as we hear in the text today. And we know there are how many things that it takes to be a sacrament? Anybody?
3.
Good job, Lord. I know everyone else is thinking.
It's either 3 or 7.
Okay. So we are commanded. That says do it. Okay, number 2, there has to be a physical element. Of course, with communion, we have a form of bread and a form of wine. Maybe it is bread without yeast, made from scratch. Maybe it is little wafers, but either way, it's bread. There is also wine, possibly in the form of grape juice, but there is wine. All right, and this is the stuff. If you remember, some of you confirmants from your first communion instructions, the stuff. You know what I'm talking about. All right, and then number 3, that God is present. As Martin Luther puts it, God is in, with, and under the bread and wine. And we all know that this is God. All right, so these last 2 sometimes can get a little bit muddy. Last week, Pastor talked about how the water that we use in baptism is not magical. It is not taken from a particular holy source. It doesn't start glowing when Pastor David picks it up.
That'd be cool.
This is gonna happen at the next baptism.
Yeah.
Okay.
Freak me out.
It's water. Sometimes it's from a river, but it is water, alright?
If it's from Flint, it might start glowing.
For
Yeah.
In communion, we have a very similar situation. The bread and the wine don't need to come from any particular holy source. God does not suddenly show up in, with, and under the bread only after pastor touches the plate, or after he says just the right words. We believe that the bread is bread, and that the wine is wine, or juice, that God is in, with, and under it, that God is there. The words said just before communion is given, the words that include Jesus' instructions, the words that you can find in your small catechism, the words that I couldn't remember yesterday, these words are called the words of institution. I think I called them the preamble yesterday.
Yes.
Okay, it came to me. But at the end of the words of institution are the words, all are welcome to the table. We call it the Lord's Supper. Sometimes. It's set at a table. We gather and we are nourished together. But I think oftentimes we lose sight of the idea that it's a meal. That it started as Jesus and the 12 were eating a holiday meal together. They were seated around a table. Jesus' instructions were not this pinnacle moment while he was teaching in front of a crowd, standing at a podium, but they were sitting at a table eating this meal, and as the bread basket was about to be passed, he took it, and he broke that bread and passed it while giving these instructions. And the meal continues, and they keep eating, they keep drinking, they keep talking, and then later he picks up a cup off of the table, and he starts speaking the words that we all know so well again. This cup is the new covenant of my blood shed for you and for all people. They were celebrating Passover, just as Jewish communities do today. They were seated at a table. They were sharing a meal together. There are a lot of different ways we can share a meal. I have had the good fortune of spending quite a bit of time in host homes, people who voluntarily choose to take you in and take care of you however they see fit. I got to experience firsthand a lot of different ways that people share meals. Some were more comfortable to me than others. Probably the ones that were more familiar to what I was used to. But let's start with a table. Maybe sometimes it's the grass. Maybe sometimes it's a bar top. Maybe sometimes it's in your car on the drive home. But there's a familiar meeting point in a meal. And then to share a meal means to be in the company of other people. We've got our people. You can add faces. And where there are people, there's talking, there's communicating of some kind. Maybe there's singing or music. But there's noise of some kind. And then, of course, there must be food. There must be nourishment of some kind. Now think about the times that we gather together in worship at the table. We don't pull up a chair right to that table, but we come to the front. The bread and the wine are waiting on that table. We are in the company of those in worship with us. We might not be talking at the time we receive communion, but we have probably shared the peace. We have been talking. And being together in silence is an altogether different kind of communicating. And there's food. There's a great and wonderful nourishment served to us by our brothers and sisters in Christ. Every time that we commune together, we sit together with the Lord at his table. And the beautiful and amazing thing is that his tables are scattered everywhere. And when we gather upstairs, when we gather right here, when we gather across town, and we commune together, we are at the table with all of God's children. We are fed, we are forgiven, and we are loved. And we experience this firsthand over and over and over again. Because Jesus did it for you, he did it for me, and he did it for everyone.